Last week, the UK government announced a nuclear energy renaissance for the country. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Adam Bell, Director of Policy at Stonehaven, to talk us through what that means. So welcome to the podcast, Adam.
Very happy to be here.
So before we dig into the detail of the announcement, you have a lengthy CV in energy policy, but perhaps you could tell us where it all began for you.
So I didn't go what you might think was kind of the traditional route of getting into energy policy, in as much as I did 2 degrees in philosophy, which is surprisingly less relevant to the engineering of electrical systems than you might expect. But essentially what that did lead to was a deep love of politics. And a deep love of politics never prompts one to join a political party and try to get involved. And I did, back when the Liberal Democrats were cool, although they insist they're cool again now. I joined the Lib Dems and started working for a local party, running local campaigns to get, local people elected to things. This ultimately gave me a lot of experience in how you change local minds, and I got a job off the back of it in the wind industry, which at the time was struggling, as it always does, with public engagement and local acceptability. So I ran a campaign to get people to like wind turbines going all around the country, making lots of exciting enemies. But what I discovered I really enjoyed was the debate around policy itself. So what do you actually do to get wind developed? What do you need to believe about the market to make different sorts of generation happen? What do you need to believe about the system more broadly? So following that, I got a job with a think tank, and then ultimately in what is now DESNZ, where I worked across heat policy, electricity policy, as well as overall energy strategy for about 7 years, quite frankly. And by the end, I had enough of the civil service, and I joined Stonehaven in 2021, just after the worst of the pandemic.
Right. And just pick up on, I suppose when you were doing wind policy, it was all the days when people were talking about blade flicker is a phrase you don't hear anymore, isn't it? And all these sort of made up problems that were going to afflict the wind industry. How did that experience sort of overcoming those sort of objections? How did that inform what you did later?
So the one I remember especially was wind turbine syndrome, which was essentially an alleged condition that affected people that live too close to wind turbines. Despite lots of research, no one could ever really figure out if it was ever real or not, or whether it was something that exists entirely inside people's heads. I think what that really gave me is a lifelong suspicion of planning control and, ironically, local control over planning, in as much as the challenge always is you can give people local control over local development, but they don't necessarily pay the costs of not developing things that are in the national interest. Mm-hmm. And this is something that's afflicted Britain and other economies to this day. How do you align giving democratic control over planning with ensuring that the incentives are right to ensure people want to support things right in the national interest? I think that kind of big problem, a big structural problem, is the sort of thing that endlessly fascinates me.
Yeah. And then when you became a civil servant and you're working in what is now, I suppose, DESNZ and its various renaming and reforming in and out of the business department and whatnot, what sort of projects were you working on?
So my very first project in the civil service was in the heat decarbonisation team, when there was quite a substantive team dealing with what was called the renewable heat incentives. So that was rolling out heat pumps and biomass boilers at the edge of the grid in rural areas. And there was also quite a substantial team dealing with the rollout of heat networks. My job was to sit in between them and try to figure out what on earth we would do with the gas network that lay between, rural areas and the urban cores that would eventually be heat networks. I was the only one thinking about that for the longest time. And essentially my job was to go, this is a very, very big problem that the department is currently ignoring. We need to allocate more resource to it. And so I built up a case for a substantive consideration of the trade-off between electrification and hydrogen for use and heat, including building the department's very first hydrogen for heat model. I worked through a lot of kind of different kind of regimes of testing you need to believe, different sorts of things about hydrogen. And they were the end point of getting the department to make essentially a decision on whether you would use hydrogen for heat or whether you'd use electricity for the bulk of the heat. I'm delighted to say that only 13 years after I started, the department is due to make a decision next year. So there we go. Who says government moves slowly?
Yeah, well, the criticism of hydrogen for heat's always been the expense of making the hydrogen. How did that factor into those models that you created?
So this was pre-net zero. And so therefore it was assumed that there would be a chunk of emissions that would be left at the end. And so the only way you can make hydrogen for heat stack up in the early days was, well, because electrolyzers are never going to beat heat pumps for price, was to assume you're reforming natural gas into hydrogen and capturing the carbon off the back, so-called blue hydrogen. The numbers for that stacked up well in comparison to heat pumps, but ultimately blue hydrogen has come cropper because of net zero. You can't realistically believe that you can still have the essentially 5% of emissions coming from steam methane reformation and still meaningfully think that you can get to net zero. You need to find a way of getting rid of that last 5%, and that becomes very expensive very quickly, which puts all the cost advantage once again back to heat pumps.
Yes. Yeah. So if we move on to this nuclear decision, the go ahead for, and I keep mixing up which one I'm talking about. The go ahead for Sizewell C, yes, that's right, not and then investment in small modular reactors, or the development of small modular reactors, I think I should say. I'm looking at a graph here that was produced by Carbon Brief of what they call the rise, fall, and rise again of UK nuclear capacity, and there was this massive building boom for nuclear in the 80s. But since that, and I muse on this because it all seemed to stop in 1989 when I was 18, and now obviously I'm a lot older than 18. Only one nuclear power station has been completed, Sizewell B, getting my things right, and then Hinkley Point has been under construction and beset by delays. So as those 1980s reactors come to the end of their natural lives just about now, we seem to be really our nuclear power capacity seems to be contracting massively. So I suppose the first question is, why did everything stop in the 1980s?
Certainly. Well, this is one of my favorite questions because it reveals a lot about how the UK approaches industrial and energy policy. So cast your mind back to the world's first commercial nuclear reactor at Calder Hall, which did provide power to the grid. It then led the build out of the Magnox generation of reactors. These were essentially relatively small devices that did produce power, but also had an important role in the weapons program. Calder Hall, although it did have a civilian use, also had a military use as well, and enriched uranium and plutonium and other sorts of products of nuclear reactions were part of their design remit. However, it became very, very clear that having a kind of dual-use reactor wasn't as cost-efficient as just having a reactor that was designed for power. The Central Electricity Generation Board, so essentially the entity that ran the nationalised industry, was charged with figuring out what sort of new design they wanted to deploy in bulk. They had to choose between a US design, which is a pressurised water reactor. So as the name sounds, just to take a step back, the way in which a nuclear reactor works is you have a reactor vessel in which you have fissile material that is going through a process of fission. It's being controlled by a series of control rods that moderate that reaction and speed it up or slow it down, depending on how much heat you want to get out of it. The heat from that reactor is then taken away by some form of cooling loop. So this what's in that cooling loop, it often determines the name of the reactor. So pressurized water is exactly as it sounds. It's water held under significant pressure, and there's such pressure that it remains liquid and doesn't flash to steam. This ends up essentially giving you a very efficient cooling loop because water is an excellent coolant. It's got high specific heat capacity, can transmit a lot of heat. That pressurized water doesn't go into a steam turbine. It connects to a secondary loop, which does have the water that goes to the steam turbine, provides power. So the PDR device, the American device, was the first one under consideration. I think it was built by either Westinghouse or General Electric. The other design that was under consideration was something called an advanced gas cool reactor. Now, for that, the cooling loop was full of carbon dioxide, which had a number of advantages over pressurized water. So, firstly, if there was some sort of breach in the cooling system and the CO2 escaped, unlike water, it's not going to explode everywhere. It's gas. It will essentially evaporate in the atmosphere very quickly. It wouldn't hang on to radiation for very long, and therefore it would essentially automatically shut the plant down. There was also the advantage purported of the AGR design that it could be refueled in flight. All those kind of fission reactions involve reinserting uranium of different sorts of richness of fissile material into the reactor every so often. The PWR design, or the refueler, you essentially had to shut it down so you could take out the old fuel rods and then reinsert them. The AGR design was intended to be refueled in flight, so you wouldn't have to switch the reactor off so often, and so therefore, in theory, it should be cheaper. So that's in-flight refueling component, plus the fact that it was British, and the government at the time thought, oh, this is great, we've got British design, we can sell overseas just like the Americans are doing, meant that the CAGB opted for the AGR design. And this would have been fine, except it turns out that it was really hard to make the in-flight refueling mechanism work, because you are inserting a fuel rod under high pressurized conditions inside the reactor vessel, and it turns out to get really, really jiggly and very hard to actually put in when the reactor is still going on. Those very technical terms.
Jiggly, yes.
In-flight refueling never really worked properly. And as a result, the reactors are always more expensive than they were ever intended to be. But we still had committed to a program of build out. We still had a nuclear workforce, and the CAGB built out a lot of those. However, by the 80s, it had become quite clear that the AGR model was not necessarily going to be the thing that was going to set the world on fire. And we were looking at restarting the program with a different design. And once again, the government turned back to an American PWR design. But by that point, because we were essentially debating whether we were going to restart a nuclear program, and nuclear power had become ever more controversial, thanks to Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island and so on and so forth. There was a significant pushback at the idea that we would build more. And this led to a significant public inquiry that lasted years and years and years before Sizewell B was given the go-ahead. While this was going on, gas from the North Sea had become ever cheaper, and we had finally started building gas-fired power stations in bulk. The government at that point, the Conservative government, I think it was in 1990, said specifically that beyond Sizewell B, we would not build any more nuclear power stations because gas was so cheap and it would be cheap forever. Therefore, we would never need to build nuclear again. Your listeners may, of course, be aware that at least one of those statements wasn't true. And gas has become ever so more expensive, while the French did in fact build out a very large nuclear fleet and weren't subject to the same price risk that we were, and paid off their nuclear capital costs quite a while ago. So that's why we stopped building nuclear power plants, a combination of poor design choices, thus poor assumptions about the future of commodity costs.
Yeah. So obviously I mentioned that Hinkley Point has gone way over schedule and over budget as well. Is that because did we lose the expertise that was used to build reactors in the 80s, or what's been the big hold up with Hinkley Point in particular?
So rebuilding our nuclear skills base has been a key part of getting Hinkley C away. The other part of getting Hinkley C away is getting the safety case approved. Modern nuclear reactors are incredibly safe. They have multiple layers of redundancy, multiple fail-safe systems, and quite frankly, it's always been hard to make a nuclear reactor melt down. They only managed that at Chernobyl by running an incredibly dangerous way, purely for the purposes of running what was essentially a black star test. What this has meant in practice is that the Office for Nuclear Regulation, as well as the Health and Safety Executive, in improving the design for Hinkley C, which is a European pressurized reactor, another pressurized water reactor, has submitted, I think, at least 3,000 separate design changes over the lifetime of that approval process, which meant that the original EPR design, which only exists, I think, which I think the Flamanville plant is now up and running, as well as the Ukaluta one. But the first one that used to be actually be built was at Tianjin in China. It's meant that there was only so much you could learn from the other construction projects that had already been undertaken, because the reactor itself was now quite different, thanks to the ONR. That has led to significant delay, as essentially we've had to relearn lessons that had been learned in other reactors, but now were slightly different because the reactor was a different design.
Yeah, because I was looking at the IEA report on nuclear energy released in January, and one thing that really surprised me was that they said that only 4 of the 52 reactors built since 2017. I don't know why they particularly picked 2017, or of either being built by China or Russia, maybe in other countries, but they are basically Chinese and Russian technology. So Russia, obvious problems, and in the current situation, and China, wasn't there a worry about the security of having Chinese control systems in critical British infrastructure? So has that been part of the problem, that really the nuclear industry has been dominated recently by actors who we are wary of at best?
I think that's right. I think post the 1980s, the West essentially decided we're not going to bother with nuclear power. And that meant that skills and expertise and design activity especially went east, and to Russia and China's benefit. At the same time, there are differences in regulatory approaches. I think it's best summarized by an event during the construction of Hinkley C. So Hinkley C was built in part in conjunction with the Chinese and brought in Chinese expertise from Tianjin. In order to complete a nuclear reactor, you need to lower essentially the cap on top of the reactor vessels. It's a very, very big concrete taps, about 20 meters across, weighs several thousand tons. This means getting a crane to essentially move a very, very heavy weight over the construction site. So the Chinese official there, who was in charge of delivering the reactor, said, yeah, this is fine. What we did at Tianjin was we just had basically all of our guys standing underneath saying left a bit, right a bit, to which the EDF official just looked on in horror, saying you can't have people underneath a suspended 2,000-ton weight. Very, very different cultures around health and safety, which have impacts upon cost and speed of delivery.
Yes. And then looking at the sort of timeframes, the government has a target of decarbonising the electricity supply by 2030, which they brought forward from the previous government's 2035 target. None of this new capacity is really going to be online. Hinkley C might be online by 2035, but none of it's going to contribute to that grid decarbonisation. Is that an issue, or is it part of the increasing electrification of our energy system, across transport and heating, as you mentioned before?
So it's possible that one reactor at Hinkley C could be online by 2030. That isn't guaranteed yet, but it would certainly help. I think when I'm thinking about nuclear power and I'm thinking about the future, I'm thinking about all those households with heat pumps and with electric vehicles, all of which will represent a significant increase in overall power demand, as all the demand that used to go to fossil fuels for transport and for heating goes towards electricity. At that point, you need enormous volumes of power. I think at least threefold our current demand. And that means you need a lot of power that's online all the time. Now, it isn't necessarily a 2030 question, but it might very well be a 2035 question. If you have to build a lot of stuff, then you might as well build a few nuclear power stations that provide a lot of power that's on all the time that you're always going to need. That doesn't necessarily a conflict, in my view, with having a lot of wind and a lot of batteries to essentially manage all the kind of intraday variation.
Yeah. So what concerns me then is, because there's big delay here, is the opportunity cost of putting large amounts of public money into nuclear when it's definitely going to deliver for future generations as much as it is to solve our current situation. Do you know if the government has made that decision deliberetely to invest now? Because and we can get onto the small modular reactors in a minute, but the cash for small modular reactors is taken from GB Energy, or is going to be from the GB Energy budget, and GB Energy was established to basically roll out renewables ASAP. So there does seem to be a little bit of a conflict there.
So if you go back to 2010, when Nick Clegg said, well, we shouldn't build nuclear because it will take 10 years to build, he was correct, but we're still going to need the power. And we could have done with them having the power in 2020. Nuclear does take a long time to build it. They are very big and complicated engineering projects, and they have to be gotten right for obvious reasons. I think what that says to me is, you're going to need us in the future. If you're doing electric vehicles, if you're doing heat pumps, you're going to need a lot of power, and you have to start somewhere. And the first best time was yesterday. The second best time is today. In terms of GB in particular, So what's happened is GB has essentially integrated Great British Nuclear, which is an existing body that was charged with delivering the nuclear fleet, and a chunk of funding that would otherwise have gone to GB essentially building and running its own renewable power stations is now going to go towards SMRs instead. I think it really depends on where do you think GB's role is best placed. So its first action was to spend about £200 million on installing solar panels on schools and hospitals. My view is that was an excellent thing for GB to do, directly decarbonising the public sector, directly reducing the energy bill of schools and hospitals, and ensuring that the taxpayer pays less to keep these structures running than they otherwise would have done. That is very much what a publicly owned energy company should be doing, making the public sector better at energy. There was always the view that it should take a role in development. And I think what's going to happen there is some of that development role will be passed to the Crown Estate, which will essentially have a Great British Energy arm. They will be facilitating the development of offshore wind, including floating offshore, by helping them with environmental impact assessments, as well as various other bits of the planning process. What is likely to fall in the way as a result of moving the cash to SMRs away from renewables is GB taking up a significant development role from itself on things that aren't nuclear power. Mm-hmm. The unanswered question for me now is, if GB is taking a significant role for SMRs, providing seed funding, is it going to take an equity stake? Is it going to operate the plants? Is it going to build and run them? That is currently unknown, because quite frankly, a publicly owned utility that's building 3 large-scale nuclear power stations is going to be enormous. Mm-hmm. And for those of us who think there's a good case for having public ownership in the energy sector, to a degree that will be much more weighty than whatever could have done with it, that 2.4 billion, if it can attract additional investment. So I think there's it's a slightly different role, but it's still a substantive role for a public player in the energy system, which is always the vision.
Yeah. Part of me wonders, though, and going back to what you were talking about, public acceptance of wind energy, whether some of this has been motivated to cover the rest of net zero. Obviously, the political right is increasingly taking aim at net zero, even though it was a conservative prime minister brought the target in, but all those people. That section of opinion tends to be pro-nuclear, no matter what the relative costs between renewables and nuclear. So I muse sometimes, I suppose, on whether some of this is to give the government a little bit of political cover, so they can point at this if the skeptics start laying into the wind and solar and battery systems that you mentioned before.
I've always viewed an awful lot of the right as having a slightly baffling approach towards energy more generally. They want to have nuclear and gas as opposed to nuclear and wind and solar and batteries, which is just a more expensive energy system overall. And it's never really made sense to me beyond them just not liking renewables for reasons that seem to be vibe-based rather than science-based. But at the same time, what we do know, and we do quite a lot of polling, that the public do really like nuclear. The opinions have changed since the 1980s markedly. It's now seen as safe and secure, and especially very much a hedge against reliance on gas. So in that sense, I think you're right. There are politics here, but there's also system design considerations too.
Yeah. And then we've mentioned small modular reactors, SMRs, which seem to be the latest thing. And I double checked because it's a long time since I touched on nuclear energy in my degree, as you can see from the beard, a long time ago, but haven't updated since. But in a summary, these are normal reactors which are small and modular, as the name suggests. But so why are they regarded as so novel? Because I spent a couple of months teaching English in Murmansk, and they had nuclear-powered icebreakers sat in the harbour, and we've had nuclear-powered submarines. Isn't there a small nuclear reactor under the Greenwich Maritime Museum? Why are these regarded as novel?
I think it's mostly because of their role on the commercial side. So you're absolutely right that we've built small reactors forever for different sorts of end uses. The US's carrier fleet is entirely powered by nuclear reactors and can go faster than anything else afloat. But there are kind of important design differences. So those carriers, those submarines, and probably the icebreaker rely on highly enriched uranium in order to get the relative amount of energy density they need for such small reactors to work. The reactors that we're talking about, the Rolls-Royce ones, will rely on conventionally enriched uranium, which is essentially not suitable for use in weapons. So they're non-military uses ultimately, and those designs therefore become important in as much as they are small reactors that you can, in theory, stamp out in the factory. If you the modular part is important. There's an assumption built into this theory that if you've got, say, somewhere like Sheffield Forge Masters, who can do a series of large castings of reactor vessels one after another, you hold down costs. Then you just pull everything aside and put it all together like Lego. Now, whether that's going to be true in practice very much depends upon the design, the way in which they're going to be rolled out. Although they're built as small, these are still very large. These are not much bigger than anything that would go in a submarine. I think the Rolls-Royce one is still several football pitches in scale. I think it's about 300 megawatt electrical, which again is still a big device. There are also almost micronuclear reactors coming on the market, which are essentially very small PWRs with about 20 to 30 megawatt electrical output and higher thermal. Those are very, very different, and I can see those coming off a production line because they are essentially production line sized. Now, which kind of design philosophy wins out in the cost battle is incredibly important. If those kind of medium scale, small MSR, so the Rolls-Royce ones come down in price enough, that's great, we will buy more. If micro reactors come down and cost a lot because they're rolling off a production line, then you can see them being used more ubiquitously, certainly for industry and potentially for heat networks as well.
Yeah, because there's been talk of using them for data centers, particularly with the rise in energy demand from AI. So is that... are we going to see these reactors distributed across the country rather than sort of installed in the legacy nuclear sites that we have around the country?
I think if they get cheap enough, and the regime allows you to install them, especially in their industry, I can see a world in which right next to Port Talbot's new electric arc furnace, you essentially have a car park full of shipping containers, each with a reactor inside, providing the power. Simply because it'll be reliable, it'll be present on site, it won't be subject to transmission costs, and it will be something that can be directly owned by industrial players. So there are lots of upsides for industry of this approach. Effectively allows them to decouple themselves from the rest of the power system. Whether the public will accept nuclear-powered hot water for heat networks, that is still to be determined. Yes. Certainly, for the smaller reactors, I would be significantly less worried about being close to them because if they ever melt down, this has just become a hot box. But I think whether a broader use is publicly acceptable, we will see.
I've just remembered, I mentioned my trip to Murmansk. I remember coming home and seeing a newspaper headline, "The most dangerous place on earth," because the small reactors which had been, in inverted commas, decommissioned were sat in various ships around the harbour, doing nothing until somebody could decide what they were going to do with them. And some of the ships weren't apparently not in good state, but it sort of does raise a question. You talked about public acceptance, whether they would, how security would work if you've got these assets which may or may not be of interest to bad actors. Even if for the kind of fear factor, you've then got a lot of sites that you would have to have a decent amount of security on.
So I think that's a fair concern. I think my assumption going into this has to be, if you are constructing anything that has fissile material, even stuff that's only suitable for a dirty bomb, you would have to have the appropriate amount of security around it. But quite frankly, our security requirements are going up all the time. I do wonder whether we need to start guarding large substations after the fires in West London. There's a lot of vulnerability about our energy infrastructure that we are currently just saying, oh, it's fine, it's fine, it's fine. I don't think in the future it will be fine. You're seeing a lot of sabotage in Eastern Europe. You'll see more closer to home.
Yeah, and the talk of wasn't it the chips in the Iranian enrichment program sort of spinning out, causing the systems to spin out of control, and nobody's entirely sure who, if anybody, triggered that. So yes, you mentioned fuel. this has always been a query of mine because I looked up the uranium reserves about 15 years ago, and it said there was about 100 years at current use. And I looked up again yesterday in preparation for this, and it said there's about 100 years. And maybe that's because of the decline in the West of nuclear. But if it's providing about 9% of global power, and the world is going electric, so that's 9% would is going to diminish if the current fleet stays its rate. But are there limitations on fuel, or are we looking at still 50 plus years?
So whenever you're talking about reserves, whether it be oil or gas or whether it be for uranium, it's also important to remember that those are related to technology at a particular time. Reserve means economically recoverable. It doesn't necessarily mean resource. So across all forms of resource, including oil and gas, including minerals, generally speaking, although you might be able to say, I can see that if we mined using current technology at current prices, there will be about 100 years of this. There'll be a lot more that simply is not currently economically recoverable. If you use more nuclear power, lo and behold, it will become economically recoverable. We were meant to run out of copper about 50 years ago. We are still making an awful lot of it. Uranium is essentially just another mineral.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's not such an issue. But there was talk when people were looking at this of thorium being a more plentiful supply. Is that still on the back burner until there's any pressure on uranium, or is thorium moving forward as a fuel? Do you know?
I think it's moving forward. Certainly, there are Generation 4 reactors that do use thorium, I think, plus molten salt as a coolant. It's simply harder to process. Not more dangerous, but simply harder to process, and therefore more expensive. When someone finds a cheap way of processing thorium, I suspect it will come to the market in bulk.
Yeah, it's safer than uranium, isn't it?
It is, yes.
Generally, yeah. That's it's an interesting one as well. So the question that's always been raised about nuclear energy is, what do you do with the waste afterwards? Was it Crosby, Stills and Nash had a song called "Don't Dig Here" because it was about the legacy of nuclear waste.
So, a lot of people have given a lot of thought of this for some time, and digging is ultimately the answer. So, in Finland, they built a geological disposal facility, which is a fancy way of saying it's a series of tunnels dug deep into the bedrock, in which lead-lined gaskets for nuclear waste are stored in bulk. I think they have about 500 years worth of storage capacity. We've looked at doing the same here up in Cumbria, and certainly I think plans for that are well advanced. It is safe. You do need to do the kind of classic intergenerational warning symbols around the tunnel so that one ventures into it by accident. All the things that say this is not a place of honor. There's many different languages and many different concepts as possible. I think that's important, but it's a sole problem in essence, short of when you're able to shoot it all at the sun.
So we've covered an awful lot of ground. So my final question I had is, if you could change one piece of policy, or introduce a piece of policy to push either nuclear or clean energy in general forward, what would you pick?
An interesting one. So I think what I would like to see is a way of making it much easier for industry to install very small nuclear reactors on site to cut costs. The UK's biggest challenges are industrial power prices. Making it cheap for people to install these novel devices on site so they can get power and heat as cheaply as they possibly can, to me, feels very much like a no-brainer. Right now, it's quite hard to do so. The new nuclear siting requirements are designed for large-scale reactors rather than small ones. We need to have a proportionate nuclear regime that enables people to essentially install their own power. Now, with the security safeguards that we talked about earlier on, if we do that, then I think we can find a way of building out these sorts of smaller devices at pace, at speed, which will just help our power costs and help our industry, help growth, and help us all afford all the things that we want.
Fantastic. Well, thanks very much, Adam, for joining us today. I think it was something of a whistle-stop tour, I think, through the nuclear industry, but I found that incredibly informative, and I'm guessing a lot of people watching and listening to this will as well. So thank you.
It's quite all right. Very happy to come on.